In 2006, the British government published a 700-page report written by Nicholas Stern, former chief economist of the World Bank. The conclusion was devastating: climate change is the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. And if we do not act now, the cost will be between 5 and 20% of global GDP. Every year. Indefinitely. William Nordhaus, Nobel laureate in economics, reached very different conclusions with a different model. Yes, we need to act, he said. But gradually. The cost of acting too fast could be greater than the cost of acting slowly. Moderate warming is manageable. Same problem. Same climate data. Opposite conclusions. How is that possible? The answer lies in a single number: the discount rate. How much we value the future compared to the present. And it turns out that this apparently technical decision is one of the most profound a society can make. In the previous episodes of this season, we have explored the great economic challenges of the 21st century: global institutions, the digital economy, digital money, automation. Today we tackle what is probably the most important of all. Climate change is not just an environmental problem. It is an economic problem of unprecedented scale. It affects production, trade, housing, migration, health, and finance. And the solutions we choose will define the economic structure of the planet for the rest of the century. We already covered the concept of externality in earlier seasons. An externality is a cost or benefit that a transaction imposes on third parties who are not part of it. A factory's pollution is the classic externality: the manufacturer does not pay for the dirty air the neighbors breathe. Climate change is an externality on a planetary and temporal scale. When a power plant burns coal, the carbon dioxide emissions accumulate in the atmosphere and warm the planet for centuries. The cost is not paid by whoever burns the coal. It is paid by future generations and by the most vulnerable countries, which tend to be those that have emitted the least. Arthur Pigou, the economist who formalized the concept of externality in 1920, proposed a simple solution: a tax equal to the cost of the externality. If polluting costs society €100, charge the polluter €100. The price internalizes the cost. The market corrects itself. In theory, it is elegant. In practice, there are two enormous problems. First, calculating the exact cost of a ton of carbon is extremely difficult because the damages are uncertain, nonlinear, and unevenly distributed. Second, carbon does not respect borders. A carbon tax in one country alone can simply shift production to countries without a tax, a phenomenon called carbon leakage. There are two main economic instruments for reducing emissions. Both try to put a price on carbon. But they work in different ways. A carbon tax sets a price and lets the market determine the quantity of emissions. If the tax is €50 per ton, each company decides whether to pay the tax or reduce its emissions. Companies for which reducing is cheap will do so. Those that cannot reduce cheaply will pay the tax. The result is that reductions happen where they are most efficient. The advantage of the tax is its simplicity and predictability. Companies know how much they are going to pay. They can plan. The disadvantage is that it does not guarantee a specific level of emissions. If the tax is too low, emissions do not fall enough. An emissions trading system, or cap and trade, works the other way around. The government sets the total amount of permitted emissions and distributes or auctions permits. Companies that emit less than allowed can sell their permits to those that emit more. The price of carbon is determined by the market. The advantage is that it guarantees the emissions level. If the cap is 100 million tons, emissions do not exceed that figure. The disadvantage is that the price can be volatile and unpredictable, making business planning difficult. The European Union has operated the world's largest emissions trading system since 2005. The early years were chaotic, too many free permits were handed out, the price collapsed, and emissions barely fell. Since the reforms of 2019, the system works better. The carbon price in Europe has risen significantly and emissions from the electricity sector have fallen. Let us return to Stern and Nordhaus. Both are serious economists with sophisticated models. Why do they reach such different conclusions? The key difference is the discount rate, how much less a future euro is worth compared to a present euro. If you use a high rate, the future matters little. If you use a low rate, the future matters a great deal. Nordhaus uses a discount rate of 3%, consistent with market interest rates. At that rate, a €1 million damage 100 years from now is worth only about €50,000 today. Conclusion: acting slowly is rational. Stern uses a rate close to zero for the portion that discounts for pure time preference, the purely ethical part that says future generations matter as much as the present one. At that rate, a €1 million damage 100 years from now is still nearly 1 million today. Conclusion: acting now is urgent. This is not a technical debate. It is a moral debate disguised as a technical one. Do the people who will be born in 2100 have the same rights as those of us alive today? If the answer is yes, the discount rate should be low and action should be immediate. If the answer is that we cannot sacrifice present well-being for uncertain future well-being, the rate should be higher. Economics cannot resolve this dilemma. It can only clarify it. In Part 12 we saw the debate between green growth and degrowth. In the context of climate change, that debate becomes concrete. Advocates of green growth argue that the energy transition can be the greatest engine of economic growth in the 21st century. Renewable energy is already cheaper than fossil fuels in many parts of the world. Electric vehicles, batteries, green hydrogen, carbon capture, all of this creates industries, jobs, and investment. China produces 80% of the world's solar panels and more than half its electric vehicles. It has turned the energy transition into industrial policy. Europe is investing hundreds of billions in its Green Deal. The United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is in reality the largest climate investment in its history. Advocates of degrowth respond that green growth is a contradiction in terms. You cannot manufacture millions of electric cars, cover deserts with solar panels, and extract lithium, cobalt, and copper on an industrial scale without generating enormous environmental impacts. The energy transition is necessary, but without reducing total consumption, we are simply swapping one problem for another. The empirical evidence does not settle the debate. Some countries have reduced their emissions while growing, the so-called decoupling. But at the global level, emissions keep rising. The question is whether technology can close the gap in time, or whether something more radical is needed. There is a financial dimension of climate change that markets are beginning to take seriously. It is called transition risk. If the world meets its climate commitments, a large portion of known oil, gas, and coal reserves will not be extractable. These are stranded assets, resources that appear on the balance sheets of fossil fuel companies but that will never generate revenue. Estimates vary, but some calculations put the value of these stranded assets at trillions of dollars. If markets recognize this all at once, fossil fuel companies lose value abruptly. Banks that have lent to them suffer losses. Pension funds that have invested in them lose value. It is a systemic risk comparable to the subprime mortgage crisis. Mark Carney, when he was governor of the Bank of England, was the first central banker to warn about this risk. Since then, financial regulators around the world have begun requiring banks and companies to assess and disclose their exposure to climate risk. Climate change does not affect everyone equally. The countries that have emitted the least are the most vulnerable. Bangladesh, which contributes less than 0.4% of global emissions, could lose a fifth of its territory to rising sea levels. Sahel farmers, who barely have a carbon footprint, face increasingly frequent droughts. Within each country, the poorest are the most exposed. They live in more vulnerable areas. They have fewer resources to adapt. They depend more on agriculture. Heat waves disproportionately kill people without air conditioning. Climate justice demands that those who have emitted the most bear more of the cost. But wealthy countries do not easily accept paying for the clean development of poor countries. The Loss and Damage Fund agreed at the Sharm el-Sheikh Climate Summit in 2022 was a symbolic advance, but its funding remains uncertain. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, climate change is the largest externality in history. The economic instruments for addressing it, the carbon tax and emissions trading, try to put a price on what the market does not see. Both have advantages and limitations, and experience shows that design matters more than the choice between one and the other. Second, the Stern-Nordhaus debate reveals that the central question is not technical but ethical. The discount rate, how much we value the well-being of future generations, determines whether we should act now or gradually. Economics can quantify the options. It cannot choose for us. Third, the energy transition creates enormous financial risks in the form of stranded assets. Green growth and degrowth offer opposing visions of the path forward, and neither has yet proven it can solve the problem at a planetary scale within the time available. Climate policy, digital money, automation, all of these debates end up arriving at the same question. Can governments always find the money to pay for what society needs? A controversial theory says yes. Its critics say that is dangerously naive. Next time, modern monetary theory.